My name is Sophie Buchaillard. I'm a Franco-British author who lives in South Wales. I've lived in Wales for 23 years and I'm the author of 2 novels. The first novel, This Is Not Who We Are, was a historical fiction inspired by my childhood correspondence with a Rwandan girl during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And my second novel, Assimilation, is the story of 3 generations of women from the same family against the backdrop of geopolitical events that shape how we perceive migration and travel today, and it's the experience of migration from a perspective that's a little bit different from the one that's usually portrayed in the media. Both books were prompted by questions, an unanswered question I had about the genocide and trying to understand what prompts an entire country to turn on itself, and understanding the link between the colonial era and what then happened in 1994 in Rwanda. And Assimilation was a response for me. As a migrant myself, I find the way the news portray migrants and migration quite upsetting. I take it fairly personally. And the book Assimilation was an opportunity for me to explore and consider where this narrative, dehumanization, comes from, and to try and show the experience of migration from a different perspective than the one that are usually portrayed in the media.
I'm Katie Munnik. I'm a Canadian poet and novelist, and I've been living here in Cardiff about 8 years now. My poetry is often focused on questions of setting, the natural world and also the built environment. And those themes come into my novels as well. My first novel was The Heartbeats in Secret, and it's the story of a young woman who inherits her grandmother's house overseas. But when she arrives to see it, she finds that there's a wild goose living in the kitchen. As you might imagine, it's a story about emigration and immigration, but also about nurture. That comes into my second novel as well, which is a historical novel set here in Cardiff in 1896. It's inspired by the real life story of a girl named Louisa Maud Evans, who lived a rather unsheltered life of a Victorian performer. She performed with balloons high up over the city, and the story tells of all sorts of balloon girls and their training and aspirations, their dreams of flight. But it's also the story of cities, Cardiff and London, where the balloon factory is, and also Paris and New York. It's a story of the ways that people move through these cities, trying to build a new life, trying to make some fame, some money, and the ways that girls perform and the ways that men ask them to.
So Katie, we met in 2021, 2022?
Somewhere around
there.
Right. I think we were partway through most of COVID.
Yes, I think so. I stalked you online. That's how we met.
Yes, about bicycles.
About bicycles. And then we met for coffee and you were very kind to give me advice on how to start a career as a writer. And so yeah, so that's how we met.
Yes, and like me, you have arrived in Cardiff, but I think you've been here a lot longer.
I've been here 23 years.
23 years.
Yes, which is, and out of this year actually, I have lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else.
Wow, okay.
So
yes.
I've flipped some sort of threshold.
Yeah. As I've moved around a lot more than that. So I've been here in Cardiff for 8 years now, but I was up in Edinburgh before that for 4 years, and then London before that, and then I was in Canada before that.
Yes. So what brought you to the UK in the first place?
My husband. He's an academic, and he had been a radio journalist, but wanted a career change for various reasons, and so he wanted to study, and it seemed like a good place. And then once you study here, then you end up staying and teaching and
yes,
all of that.
Indeed.
But you come from an academic background as well,
I
but
did.
you haven't moved around. That seems quite atypical for...
Yes, I mean, I think it's quite common to people who come to Cardiff University. Cardiff has a way to suck academics in, and there's not as much turnover as there is in other universities, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yes, I originally came, I had a scholarship to come for a year to do some research 23 years ago. And I came with a friend. The friend went home and I stayed behind. But then I was offered another post in the university. But I was my first love, my first training was in political science.
Yeah, so not literature at all.
Not at all.
So you've come to literature a little bit later.
Yes. Well, I did a baccalaureate in literature in France.
Okay.
My parents at the time were adamant that you couldn't really make a career as a writer and I should do something sensible. So as a good girl, I did as I was told. Studied political science and then worked in that world for a long time. So I worked as a campaigner and as a policy advisor until 2019.
Ah, good. So recent then, yes.
Very recent.
Yes.
And what about yourself? Did you always want to be a writer?
Yes.
Were you always a writer?
Yes. I too studied literature. I also studied theology, but at the same time as studying theology, I was studying literature. And they went very well together. And then after my studies, I ended up working for a series of churches in various communities. But at the same time, I was always writing, and I was doing literature, I was publishing poetry and short fiction. But then I was also bringing in article writing about theology and different matters of faith development as well. But it was really only coming to Cardiff that I left the many jobs aside and could really focus on fiction. So that was when I wrote my first novel, was The Heartbeats in Secret. That was my first year here in Cardiff.
Oh, right. Okay.
And yet it's not a Cardiff story at all.
No.
But I didn't know Cardiff well enough at that stage to put it on the page, I think.
Yes, because it's set in Scotland.
Well, it's set between Scotland and Canada.
And Canada.
And a couple of different locations for both of them.
Yes. Oh, that's interesting. So yes, I suppose my journey was a much longer one. So when I first came to Cardiff, I joined the writers group with the intention of developing my writing. But I think I was quite young at the time, and the group was much older women, and I felt quite vulnerable when they were giving feedback. And I think I didn't really know how to receive feedback as a writer at the time, and I took the feedback personally. And I think it stopped me in my track for quite a while. And I think, strangely, the campaigning work and the policy work, because there's a lot of writing and editing that comes with that, and the need to be quite precise with the words you use in order to convey for maximum effect, really helped me train my writing.
Oh, good.
So by the time I came back to writing in 2019, obviously I was older and less fussed about negative criticism.
Yes, you move through that stage of not really caring what other people think anymore, and just focusing on the stories that you want to tell and how you want to tell them.
That's right. But it's interesting that your first book was set between Canada and Scotland. So how much of that was inspired by your own journey?
Interesting. I wouldn't have said at the time that it was inspired by my own journey, even though it's obviously there. But the locations in it felt autobiographical about my family, although the characters are not my family at all, and the things that happen are more dramatic than anything in my personal history. But the locations were very important. So I thought that I was writing a book about places, and how places affect who we are as people and also the decisions we make. Yes. But yeah, there's a lot in it about emigration, the leaving of home, and immigration, searching for home, being in new places, and birds in it as well. So you've got that too.
And your characters are strong female characters as well.
Yeah, trying to find their own paths. So that's something that we have in common.
Yes, yes, very much so. Yeah. There is a symmetry there.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, assimilation is also, I mean, in the same way, exactly as you describe, is inspired by aspects of my family, but not at all the story of my family. And is the story of 3 generations of women and how they are influenced, impacted by the change to our the changing relationship to travel
Okay. Yeah.
And from the colonial era to the 60s, and I suppose the marketization of travel to the way that we perceive migration today.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. You have characters who are involved quite concretely with their career, with travel, with the flight attendant,
yes,
and then the pilot as well.
That's right.
I was interested in that and how you researched that element of it.
Right, so that element is inspired by my mother's life. My mother
really?
was,
okay, so that is family there.
That's actually so. Not the story is not her, but she trained as a flight attendant. She was a flight attendant in an era, and I remember as a child traveling with my parents, having conversation about the way travel had changed. And I think at the time when she worked in the 60s it would have been a very glamorous position where women were expected to present a certain way, and it was part of a much broader societal change, I think. And pilots were seen as very important people because I suppose they could quite literally bring people places.
Yes. And travel itself was seen as an occasion and an event.
Yes.
I remember my parents talking about getting dressed up for flight. So they wouldn't wear their most comfortable clothes at all, that they would look good.
Yes.
And they had a story about, it may have been coming back from their honeymoon, but that they were looking impeccable. And they were upgraded because of that. And so this was a lesson that we had to take on, that if you look good enough when you travel, you might be more comfortable.
Brilliant.
But you weren't to dress comfortably.
That's great. Yeah. But yes, I mean, there was an element of glamour and an element of occasion. And I remember traveling with Pan Am when Pan Am still existed, where you would sit down for your flight and they would bring you all sorts of presents. And especially as a child, they had packs of toys for the children, and they would give you toiletry bags. And I mean, it's unthinkable nowadays.
Yes, quite.
Blankets and then little jackets. And then there was all sorts of branded gear to really embrace the experience, which is... it seemed magical as a child.
My experience of leaving Canada when we moved here, I had 2 small children and life had changed dramatically. We were relaunching and we were flying at night. So the children were in their pajamas and I was worrying, would they sleep and all of this. And we were dressed very comfortably. Yes. But because we were a family with small children, they put us on the plane first, and we had the bulkhead, there was lots of space. And we got the children settled, and the flight attendant came and she gave us champagne.
Oh, very nice.
And it was, okay, we can do this. But it felt not like glamour, but pure compassion. As if she was saying, you're going to need this.
Be okay. Yes.
It's going to be fine.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I remember flying to Malaysia with my husband, and there was a family with a really small child on the plane, and they had a little hook-on system, so you could put the baby in a cot and the baby could sleep in this incredibly long flight. That's such a brave move to travel with such a small child.
Yeah.
Shakespeare Street is half an hour from the train station, if you know where you're going. She didn't, but didn't mind. She was tired after a day of travel, but glad to be in the city at last, and glad to be walking after all the time on the train. The streets opened up around her, and she could go anywhere now, be anyone, ask for anything she wanted, because you weren't going to get it if you didn't ask. And she would, wouldn't she? Everything she wanted could start here. She swung out her arms and took long strides, trying to look purposeful and confident. The first thing she needed was a place to sleep. The hotels by the station had seemed too grand, and she didn't even have a suitcase. Well, she'd aim a little lower. A rooming house would do fine, and she'd tell them her things had been sent on separately. That sounded good. They'd be delivered on arrival. They even sounded plural. Imagine, suitcases. The evening was warm and comfortable, lovely, with ladies and gentlemen walking arm in arm, and tall city buildings all around. There was a gracious air about this city, an elegance and freedom, and all along the street the trees were leafy and green. She wondered which way it was to the castle. It was supposed to be right in the center of the city, only the buildings were getting in the way. So many shops with bright windows, so many things on display. She walked slowly, taking everything in, and kept her eyes open for theaters. A man smiled at her as he passed, so she smiled too, and the evening was coming on, and the light beginning to fade. The streets narrowed, and there were train tracks and houses, then a church on the corner with fancy brickwork, and a great square tower which made the houses around look small and dirty, and children played outside. There were no adults here, no one telling them to be quiet. She passed them by, ignoring their laughing, which might have been Welsh or maybe Italian, all those dark-haired children singing. Past the church, a small square unfolded between the buildings, centered with a tall white statue of mother and child. The grass looked soft enough to sleep on. It might be as good a place as any, and it looked safe enough. Only those children were still noisy in the street, and they'd see if she stopped, maybe wonder if she was going to pray, maybe bother her if she wasn't. And here was one of them right behind her now, still teasing, not teasing, she couldn't tell. But he grabbed her hand and pulled hard, pointed towards a house with paper in the front window. Rooms. Well, there was the answer then.
So I think my coming to Cardiff was quite different from yours, because mine was pre-children, and I arrived as is described in the simulation. I arrived 3 days after September the 11th on the first day when flights had reopened, and there were only 3 of us on the plane. Okay. And the flight was going from Paris to Cardiff, stopping in Cardiff, and then carrying on to Belfast, I think. And I was the only person stopping at Cardiff. So my first time arriving in Wales, they landed the plane. I came off the plane. I was the only person coming off the plane, and there was nobody at the airport. It was empty. It was quite a surreal experience.
That's quite unreal, yes.
So my first encounter of Wales was purely one of landscape, because I didn't see a soul for the first hour. It was a very, very strange experience.
The passages that I shared in our previous recording are from the aerialists, and both of them are about arriving in a city. So one of them is arriving in London, and it's very peopled. The characters arrive together, and then they're traveling through the city together, and they're aware of how different people look and what that signifies about who they are within this urban environment. And what I was trying to convey with that was a feeling of navigating a place together and not being certain, but thinking how you can protect each other in this new space. But then the other one is a solo character, a younger girl traveling, and she arrives on her own, unprotected, unsheltered, quite vulnerable. And she is electric with freedom. She is so excited by it. She's aware of some of the dangers that she's going to encounter, but this feeling that freedom is hers, and she only has to claim it, and this city is going to be her space. Which I think is something that when you travel, you play with both of those. How can I be safe here? How can I build community? How can I be utterly independent and new?
Yes.
Does that resound?
Yeah, very much so. I think the character of Charlotte in Assimilation has this, is driven by a need to find her freedom. But the moment she arrives in Cardiff, she suddenly realizes that vulnerability and that sense of being totally anonymous in a space where she doesn't know anyone, and having to balance the two.
So I'm going to interrupt. I love the description of how naive you are when you arrive somewhere, and that is almost a cartoon of the city that you are holding in your head, and how that then becomes reconciled as you deal with the grim realities of it.
Yes, very much so. And I think compared to This Is Not Who We Are, where the character of Victoria arrives in the UK under very different circumstances, running away from genocide, and having absolutely no concept of the city where she's going. So she's not actually aware that she's going to arrive in the UK. And the whole experience being a surprise, and a surprise of greyness mostly, I think. The shock of the palette of colours being so different.
No, it's a very good observation, because that is something that we who come to the UK experience and have to reconcile.
Yes.
Just all the differences. And I lived in London first, and the blankness of faces.
Yes.
And what does this mean about the people around me? What does it mean about the person I am in this space? Am I the same person I was at all? How do I develop continuity there?
Yes.
Yeah, I might want to talk a little bit about the characters that we have chosen to write about in these new spaces. Who do we bring into which spaces? Why do we want to tell their stories? So you've talked a little bit about escaping genocide and that, and maybe that's a place to unpack.
Yes, I think, I mean, I've said elsewhere, but this is not who we are. Was inspired by my own experience of having a pen friend when I was 16, and not knowing what happened to my pen friend was in Rwanda during the genocide in 1994. And I think this is something as a writer where it was always at the back of my mind. And it kept coming back in my writing. I would write short stories, and Victoria was there, and I would write a little piece of poetry, and she was there, and eventually it became obvious that I needed to do something with that. But as I wanted to do some research to try and use this as a way for me to understand what leads people to committing act of genocide. How do we lose our humanity so much that this happens, and it happens over and over again? And through the process of doing the research, I became interested in what happens after, because often in the news you hear about the event at the time, but then as time moves on, we forget. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I was doing a master's in creative writing at the time, and I was about twice the age of the people on the course, and none of them had ever heard of the genocide in Rwanda. And I appreciate that none of them were born, or if they were born, they were very small. But it shocked me that they didn't know anything about what is quite a significant historical event, and it's wondering about the people who experienced it at the time and what happens. And in 2024, this year, is marking 30 years since the genocide. And the resonance of that event still exists, is very present in the daily life of people in Rwanda and people who escape Rwanda and live as migrants elsewhere. And for everyone else, it's a moment in history in the past, and we've moved on. And it's trying to reconcile those two elements that drove me to writing a character who then comes to the UK, and trying to think about what happens and how do you reconcile the normality of life, the discovering a country which is totally alien to you, and trying to fit in, and trying to read the social cues, and trying to understand how you become another in a new place, whilst carrying all that trauma. And I think to me, that's what writing does. Writing is about trying to find answers to questions that are.
Yeah, that question of identity, that how you become another in a new place, is fascinating, because I think you go through stages, which I think that we've depicted with many of the characters here, of that exciting freedom. But then that blurred edges, the who am I? Am I a different person here? And language comes into that. I had a friend who moved to France for a while, and he's Canadian, bilingual, but working in a French environment and coping just fine. But his comment was that his character changed. He wasn't the same person within any set of any social environment. He interacted differently. And so then what did that mean about how he was seeing himself and how he was seeing this place? And that really fascinated me. And I think that with all of these characters who are very much on the move, you get that isolation from self as well as isolation from origin going on. I want to pick apart a little bit that idea of home and what is home. But perhaps before we get into it, sort of as a plot question in our books, thinking a little bit about craft. And both of us have relocated ourselves from where we started and established literary careers.
Yes.
And so how does being away from home influence that? I'd love to hear your stuff, and then I've got a few thoughts of my own to share on that as well.
That's an interesting question, because I suppose my relationship to what home is, or where home is, has changed. And I think there's a disconnect between people who will perceive me because of the accent as being of elsewhere, and the fact that because my family is here, my son was born here, to me home is where my loved ones are. So there is always that sense of disconnect. But what coming from another place gave me is that beginner's mind of looking at the place with the eyes of the outsider and seeing things that you don't necessarily notice when it's your own place. And then as time went on, going back to visit families in France is turning that gaze back onto the place where I came from, and seeing France with beginner's eyes and with quite a critical eye that you wouldn't necessarily have if you're in a society, in a culture. And I think in practice for me, what it's done is, both of my books are quite critical of the French government and the French relationship to its colonial past. And I think that's where that comes from, largely. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but
well, I think we're kind of getting there.
What about you?
Well, I want to talk about Elif Shafak first, actually. Yes. She has some really good paradoxical words to put into this. She talks about how separation is a form of connection.
Yes.
And that absence lets us lean in and be closer than we could be if we were physically present.
Yes.
And of course, she's saying this as a Turkish writer who writes in English, so there's the language element too. But added to that is the idea of, can you actually write French literature? Can I write Canadian literature from afar? And I don't think that's an answerable question. I think that's something that we'll spend our careers working through. I'm often asked, are you a Welsh writer? Are you a British writer? Are you a Canadian writer? And sort of play with that a little bit. I like to use Canadian in my biography because it helps people understand what the accent is.
Yes.
But the inevitable question is, so are you going home?
Yes.
And I just hear the going and home, and what are these things?
Yes.
What does it mean to stay? What does it mean to go? Tricky questions.
Yes. It is, yes, but it is about perception, isn't it? It's about the perception and the assumptions that others make because of the way they hear.
Absolutely.
I had a strange experience last week. I was asked to organize an art installation, and as part of the installation, I'd recorded myself reading a series of words, and then I got people to listen to the words and to react to them. And the recording lasted 3 minutes, and at the end of it we ended up having a conversation about accents, and it occurred to me that because of my accent, people had focused on the intonations and the accents, not the actual meaning of the words.
Oh, fascinating.
Which in itself was quite telling. So I'm always fascinated by that. Yes, the assumptions other people make. And I think assimilation for me was very much a way to try and convey to people the fact that the migrant experience is not a homogenous experience, that there are many migrants and many experiences of migrations. It's in fact fairly personal and fairly unique, I would say.
Yes.
And it's quite unhelpful to lumber everyone under a series of labels. I'm very anti-labels generally. and to reconnect with the individual, I think.
Yeah.
Very much. Both my books, I think, are about an attempt to, or an opportunity for people to try and reconnect with individual experience of migrations.
Yes, I think you do that quite well, adding elements of surprise, that the story doesn't go quite where you think it will, that you expect a character to react in a certain way because of their background, but they do the reverse.
Yes.
And I think maybe that's echoed in my work as well. I'm thinking particularly about the aerialists. There's a great deal of perhaps not surprise, but deception. The idea of costumes and performing and the truths we tell. Are they really true? Are they just what we want to be true? And then how do you take someone else's story apart to find out who they really are and what they mean in a wider sphere as well?
Yes. Can you say a little bit about how the story came about?
Oh, certainly, yes. Well, there's a good Cardiff story.
There's a good Cardiff story.
Yes. So it starts, as probably many stories start, with a walk in a graveyard.
Yes.
Couttet Cemetery is a wonderful place, as you know, and quite a historic graveyard. And as you walk around, you see the different stones, you read the names and the dates, but the words really convey so much. And one stone really caught my eye. And it had the details about a girl who was 14 and a half years old. And that detail just hit my maternal heart. I know what 14 and a half looks like.
Yes, yes.
And then the other bit that stuck with me was that she ascended via balloon and descended via parachute. And I just wanted to know why. Yes. That detail happened and that it was recorded. So there was a story there that I needed to hear more about. But also the stone itself, well, rather like your accent is a story in and of itself. The stone itself was a story because it was so white and so clean and old, 1896, yes. But it had been kept clean and there was money in it to start with. It's a bit of an elaborate stone and it has a nice little poem on it. So reading that made me want to find out more, and so I went to the archives and read the historic newspapers, and I learned a lot about not only that story, but all the balloon performers. Who are these people who would do this, and why? What is it that they're looking for? Who do they want to be? And then in doing that, I started to look at Cardiff differently, because until then I'd been walking the streets, I'd been on my bicycle along the river, taking the kids back and forth to school. But now I wanted to get up and I wanted to look down on the city and how that changes perception of the patterns that I was tracing through the city, the ways I was walking. But also how the city is constructed. And Cardiff's a marvelous place. It's continually reinventing itself, long before the Industrial Revolution, but then dramatically with it. So I would write in the library, up on the top floor, and there's a marvelous chair with the windows. I mean, it's all plate glass. And so you are looking down on the city right there at the top of everyone's heads. And then I climbed the tower in the castle and looked down from there. But perhaps the best height experience was I managed to get on top of the old library in the Haze. Yes. There was one of these open doors activities. And so I signed up for a tour of that. And you know, you go through the whole place and you look at the wonderful tile work inside. But the roof was what I really wanted. And being able to look down on the church that's nearby, which is medieval Cardiff, and the Victorian department stores and the modern developments. That was really fascinating.
Yes, I'm sure. I always find that walking down St. Mary's Street, or when you look at eye level, you have all those cafes and bars, but when you look up, there's all that history of all the old buildings, and you see all the theatres and the industrial buildings and the banks and some of the buildings are absolutely stunning.
And there's dates on so many of them too. Yeah. So you can think not only about what it looks like now and what it looked like then, but the stages of development.
Yes. I remember when reading the aerialist, or you have those descriptions of your character walking the city, and I remember, I suppose because it's a space that I'm familiar with as well, trying to imagine your process as you were trying to cast yourself back in time
Yeah.
to try and imagine the city as it was then, rather than how much of that was research and how much of that was imagination?
Well, both. I mean, so process-wise, what I do for research is I try and immerse myself in it. I spend a lot of time reading, not just in the archives and the historical documents, but also reflections on Victorian dress. What are they wearing under all those layers? And so getting detail and detail and detail, and then setting all of that aside and writing the story and hoping enough of it trickles in. That's disingenuous. Hoping I can, I mean, so much of it does trickle in, and,
Yes.
and I get distracted by the details. So then in the rewrite and the edit, I need to take out the distracting details or the details I've added just to sound clever and knowledgeable about things, and make certain that the details are serving the story.
Yeah.
But then some things come in that I didn't expect. So in, I think, the scene you're talking about, there's the smell of fried potatoes at one stage. Now, I thought that that was in there because I'd been reading about Jewish migrants to the community and what they were selling in their cafes and fish and chips.
Yes.
But readers say, oh, you're in is it Ship Alley?
Ship Alley, Caroline Street.
Yeah, so
Yes.
right by the library where I was walking all the time.
Yes.
So I was receiving the research on two levels. The one was hungry me on the way for lunch,
Yes.
and the other was what I read on paper.
Yes. That process of the percolation always fascinates me, of retrospectively looking at the book that you've created. And sometimes I surprise myself thinking, where did all this come from? the trying to track back which bit of information led where.
Yeah.
And I find it fascinating that at the point when the book comes out into the world and you do events and people ask questions, you suddenly realize that there's all sorts of layers in your book that you didn't really know were there. Some subconscious is writing a lot of books, I think. It's a fascinating process.
Yeah. Some of that must have come out with, as you were writing them as part of your degree programs.
Yes.
Because you would have readers then contributing.
Yes.
I was finding that surprise element was coming out during the editing for me, because I was surprised by how many people are involved in editing a book. I thought that getting published I would have an editor,
Yes.
but I had an editor for structural, and then I would have another editor who would be doing the line edits and all the different bits and
All right,
pieces
okay,
and the
that's
proofreading.
interesting.
And each of them would come with other questions, which would deepen my own reading of my text,
Yes.
which was very useful, and I think probably has made me a better writer because of that, hopefully.
Yes, I think I had quite an unusual experience, because I suppose the writing stage normally is quite a personal and private space, because my first novel, This Is Not Who We Are, was done as part of my master's, and Assimilation was done as part of my PhD. Along the way I had readers, reading steps.
Yeah.
And I think particularly I had the same supervisor for both. Richard Gwynn was a wonderful ear. But we had those surreal meetings where we'd come in his office and sit down, and we wouldn't talk about the writing at all, and I'd come out full of ideas. And I don't know, this is just a conversation with him that seemed to unlock the next stage in the story.
Fascinating.
And we'd have stories that had nothing, we'd have conversation that had nothing to do with the book, the theme of the thesis, or anything in between. So my thesis was about travel writing, and about the fact that travel writing typically has been a very white, privileged, Western male-dominated environment or industry, and that very narrow lens has shaped how we see travel, and that distinction between travel and migration.
Okay. Yes.
Whereas obviously women traveled as well, but they didn't really write about their travel as much, or if they did it as companion or capacity as a secondary person. And the one I always go back to is Catherine Fallon, she was a vagabond writer with Jim Fallon, her husband, and he wrote a lot of novels about his experience, and a book about travel writing, about the experience of being a vagabond in the 1960s. And she did as well, but she always wrote from the perspective of being with him and talking about his experience, not her experience, which is fascinating. And then when he died, she found herself in a position where she had all this grief, And the traveling became a way for her to manage the grief. So she underwent this ridiculous journey where she went from the UK, she traveled all the way to Afghanistan and back on foot and got herself in a situation where you think it's completely incredible. But at no point did she describe herself as a writer or a traveled writer or a vagabond. She was very much, I don't know, going with the flow, and not really. There's no critical element to her journey, because she lived in a world where women didn't write about travel.
Oh, fascinating.
And so that was in the background whilst I was trying to write the creative component and of assimilation. So I think a lot of those readings about travel writing and how travel writing has reshaped itself in post-colonial era has informed the book as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Blue paper. In my mind, family was always a nomadic clan with its own moors, peppered with Arabic expressions, the smell of ras el hanout, platters of tagine, kefta and corn de gazelle. I never stopped to think about the lives they lived, my ancestors, taking root in large houses tended by indigenous servants. All I retained was a tradition of perpetual movement, sketched in notebooks and travel journals by a network of people held together with pale blue international paper marked par avion. Cardiff. I landed in the UK on 14th of September 2001. At Charles de Gaulle Airport, the security staff narrowed their eyes at the elderly lady whose handbag contained green wool and knitting needles, confiscating the lot in the name of national security. A uniformed man sporting a Union Jack asked me if I was carrying nail clippers, waving in the direction of the plastic box from which a green thread had started to unravel. The request conjured up the instant image of a cartoonish character popping out of a suitcase like a jack in a box, armed with a minuscule nail clipper, leaping at the self-important man. Death by 1,000 cuts, I murmured. You think this is a joke? The guard took a step closer, hand hovering above his sidearm, while so in his eyes frightened me. A mix of righteous anger and frenzied panic. I watched as he pulled his weapon in slow motion, his face contorted into a mask as he took aim. My body shuddered in response to an imaginary discharge. No, nothing sharp, I replied. My words hurried, feeling smaller than a pin. I scanned the content of my compact navy blue suitcase as the man spread it out on the metal table. 1 green jumper, 2 pairs of socks, 2 plain t-shirts and a long flowery skirt, the toiletry bags in sturdy brown canvas labelled Panam, a present for my mother, a remnant of a different era of travel. Lastly, all my underwear. Eyes fixed on me, he ran his searching fingers amongst my clean knickers. Shaken, I averted my eyes. Go, he said, after what felt like several minutes. I gathered my things pell-mell into the suitcase and fled towards the departure lounge, feeling sick at the thought of the man's invasive hands.
So, second novel.
Second novel.
Often they're described as very difficult, but I think instead of talking about that, what if we talk about the process of starting it and the experience of writing it? How is it the same? How is it different?
Well, the first and the second novel. Mm-hmm. I find that fascinating. I'm trying to write a third novel at the moment, and what I find is at the start of that process, it occurred to me I could not remember how you start writing a novel. I think it's the best I can do. And I think in my case, because my novels were tied with academic education and the fact that I had a structure behind it, there was a certain need to work to somebody else's schedule, which kind of pushed me on.
Yes.
In a way that I now don't have that. So I think I'll turn the question back to you, is that how do you do it when you don't have someone saying, well, I need to see 3,000 words by next week?
Well, I really think that every novel is a different writing experience.
Yes.
I almost wish it wasn't, but that is part of the excitement of writing a novel, is learning how to write this novel.
Yes.
So with my first novel, you're going to hate me for this, but it just came to me when I saw a street sign,
Yes.
and I thought, I know something about people who've seen this sign before.
Right.
And then by the next morning, I had characters and the structure, and I knew what I was doing. That was the beginner's luck, beginner's mind, a very different experience. Going into the second one, I had a story because it was a slice of Cardiff history,
Yes.
but I needed to develop how to tell that. The story gave me clues on that, but I had a great deal of space to play because I thought, if this is history, where are the gaps in history? What don't I know? Where are the spaces where I could put new people, my own people? Where can I put fiction into the fact?
Yes.
And how can I build fiction that augments the fact, that offers shadow, that offers illumination in different ways? So that was the game I was very much playing with the aerialists.
Yes.
My characters of Laura and Douglas are completely fictional, but they offer, well, new ways of looking at the questions of performance and roles of outsiders in society. Both of them are people who have come into Cardiff and found work there, and found ways of building their identity based on the opportunities that are there.
Yes, there's something specifically about historical fiction that you have that element of research, and is how much of the fact do you feed into the story and how much do you build around. So like yourself, I have the main character in my story, Victoria, This Is Not Who We Are, is based on the real individual, but all the character around her brothers, Aris's family, are all invented characters who are there to serve her story, I suppose, and to present different aspects of the experience of migration, of finding out historical event, of trying to understand responsibility about the West's responsibility in engineering the genocide.
I wanted to focus in on character a little bit there. You say that she's a real person, but who you present on the page is not the real person.
No, of course not. No,
so how did you find that element of honouring who she is and representing it, and padding as well? How did that reconcile on your desk?
Not consciously.
Okay.
Not consciously. I think
that's probably for the best.
Yes, not consciously. I think very much through my writing process so far, and I think less so now because I guess I've become more aware of the stages of the writing in a way that I wasn't. So you call it beginner's luck. I think it's just the not knowing was for me. I just sat and I wrote.
Yeah.
And as I wrote, and the characters emerged, I had some idea of what I wanted the characters to do. And as I went on, the characters didn't want to go that way. And I sound mad when I say that, but my characters very much had different ideas about where we were going with this. And particularly the characters of Benjamin, who was Victoria's brother, was a very tortured character, who was a young 15-year-old boy who had to reconcile a life of living with having taken part in a genocide. Yeah. And all that was me spending 7 months absorbing research about what happened in Rwanda, and then talking to survivors and trying to collate from that to build the characters from the ground up. But once I'd done that, the character then took a life of its own. Yeah. And we went on, we went very much off-piste from there. And I find that fascinating. I think as a writer, I often see myself as a scribe rather than a creative.
Yeah, so much of it is listening,
yes.
and it's listening to what you've received, but it's also listening to the story that you're telling yourself,
yes.
Particularly in early drafts, and then discerning that process in later drafts.
Yes.
There's a complication with writing real people, isn't there?
Yes. Yes, there is.
Because you want to get them right, but you also want to show them in some of the human ambiguity of experience. I had that difficulty with the aerialists because there is perhaps a crime in the middle. Is it a crime is a question, and whose crime is it?
Yeah.
And after publication, I have met family members of some of these characters. That was difficult as a thought beforehand, however, lovely people, and always forgiven. But the question came up of, what do you think about these people? Did he get it wrong? Should she have done something else? What is this person's essential character?
Yes.
And it's almost as a novelist you feel that you should have answers for this, that these are the villains, these are the good ones. But I think that that's taking it entirely wrong. I don't think I can write fiction if I'm just going to characterize people as the good ones. So honoring all of that ambiguity is tricky.
Yes.
But it keeps the imagination ticking over.
Very much so. And I think it's Hilary Mantel who said that as a historical fiction writer, that you can never do entirely right, because people will always expect you to get the historical facts right, but that's not really what the story is about. And at the end of the day, the characters and the events need to serve the story, not the historical events.
Yeah.
And it's a fine line, especially when you then meet people in real life. And I think I was particularly aware of that in the context of Rwanda, because of the sensitivity of the material, and I very much felt the need to check with survivors along the way.
And you had sensitivity readers, didn't you?
Many,
yeah.
many. But it was quite a humbling experience. With assimilation, because a lot of it is based on, was inspired by family stories. I felt that I had more agency to tell the stories in whichever way I wanted to tell the stories. So I suppose the creative element there is much freer.
Interesting.
And I don't know if you found that with your first novel as well.
Well, my first novel, being a first novel, I was just writing it for myself. So I felt absolutely free, and I could make anything up. I think that the research came in as a way of making the landscape accurate, and the historical context. So there's stuff about the Second World War in it, and I was reading Polish soldiers' diaries, and also the diaries of Scottish women who were meeting some of these Polish soldiers. So that was marvelous to get the two perspectives on the same place. But I didn't feel that I had to get any particular person right, because my people were completely invented.
Yes.
As was the goose. And perhaps this brings us to talk a little bit about animals, because we've both incorporated animals
in our stories
as well. I'll talk a little bit about the goose to start with. So in The Heartbeats in Secret, a young Canadian woman inherits her grandmother's Scottish house. And so when she arrives, she finds that there is a wild goose living not just on the property, but in the kitchen. And she has to reconcile that use of space, let's say, but also relationship. So you get companionship in there, and a question of what is home. And I did want to get the goose right. And I have received criticism that I haven't, because, it's a Canada goose. It's a wild Canada goose living in Scotland.
Yes.
In North America, there are a lot of Canada geese that will be in parks and golf courses and parking lots of the local Walmart, and they're a menace. They're noisy, horrible things, and they make people's life difficult. I think I depicted difficult life, but I only have one goose in here, not dealing with many of them, and perhaps dealing with the muck in a different way. So people tell me that my goose is not nasty enough.
Right.
First novel, you get things wrong. You have a bear.
I do have a bear.
And your bear plays perhaps a different role, not quite as concrete as my goose in the kitchen.
No, so the bear is an ambiguous bear.
Quite.
It's quite an ambiguous bear. And the bear came from, there was a bear. My grandmother did grow up in what was Indochina at the time, so now Vietnam. And as a child, she had a pet bear called Arthur. And as a small child, I grew up hearing stories of Arthur the bear, and the bear took mythical proportions. And there was a bit of a mystery about what happened to the bear. I was never entirely certain what happened to the bear. And so the bear, a little bit like, you know, this idea at the back of your mind, the bear materialized in assimilation and then ended up taking quite a big part. First as a real bear, as a flesh and blood bear, and then as suppose as an archetype, as a symbol of the many complexities of migration and trauma that the character of Charlotte experiences, and is the physical embodiment of all the things in her life that she cannot entirely articulate to herself, I suppose.
And yet he's also a pastoral figure. He's a companion in certain ways.
Yes.
There's a comfort about his physicality, even if it's abstract.
Yes, I mean, there's a certain indulgence. So I did research the bear because the bear, so I'm not certain, but the bear that would have been in the type of bear that would have been in Vietnam at the time, were a very particular type of bear. They would have been honey-colored and really, really quite small. And again, my child mind is thinking of this as, you know, this gigantic teddy bear. I have a there's a story of when I was small, growing up in Paris. I'll circle back to the fair, but they opened an IKEA shop in Paris, and my parents and I went to the shop, and as they did then, as they do now, they sell cuddly toys for children to try and entice children and to get their parents to buy things. And on the ceiling, all I remember of that shop, I must have been 6 or 7 at the time, is this enormous white bear that was attached to the ceiling. And I don't think I've ever wanted something so much as a child than the bear. And obviously my parents, it was a massive bear and it was ridiculous. So my parents said no. And it was
quite sensibly.
Quite a ridiculous trauma of, you know, as a small child of really wanting that thing. And I thought, you know, in the context of a real bear, this idea of that my grandmother would have had a flesh and blood bear, but as a pet or as a companion or as a living cuddly toy, and everything that's wrong with that, and everything, and how it embodies everything that's wrong with the colonial eras, that the family felt that it was entirely okay to adopt a pet bear and to give that as a gift to a child, which, I mean, we did go on for hours. And then to contrast that with, as a child, having a small cuddly toy and the comfort that comes with cuddly bears. And what happened when the two somehow collide or merge, or where trauma makes, you know, your mind see the world in strange and wonderful ways. Yeah. And trying to reconcile the irreconcilable in your life by making things up, which is, I suppose, what we do as writers all the time anyway.
Absolutely, yes.
So the bear is the embodiment of many things.
Yes, yeah, digging into what's there and also what we need. That's interesting.
Yes.
I was doing some reading recently on derivations of the word bear.
Yes.
And there's a lovely Russian one. In Russian, I don't speak Russian at all, so I don't know pronunciation, but it looks like medved is the word for bear. And it means he who knows where the honey is.
Yes.
So I was playing with that idea, and the idea of being a writer in a different place. Yes. Because when we arrive in a different place, we don't know where the honey is. We don't know where the sweetness is, where the sources of life are. And our eyes are open and we're looking. And perhaps, I don't know if you like this one, but perhaps we need to track the bear. We need to be bear hunters. Yes. Not necessarily finding the honey for ourselves, but finding those who can help us find the honey.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
As I was writing the book, I read, I think her name is Natasha Martin, and she's an anthropologist, of Russian origin anthropologist. Okay. She lives in France, and she was doing some research in the mountains in the Ural, and she got mauled by a bear and lost half of her face. And she wrote a sort of travel book about the experience of coming home and people
wow.
treating her differently, and then being compelled to going back to the place where her and the bear, as she describes it, kissed. And the people there with their folklore and their tradition, associating her with a she-bear and seeing her as being part woman, part bear, and how that completely changed the perspective on the world. And she said, as an anthropologist, she'd spent half of her life trying to order the world and label the world and try to understand the world. And then once she was mauled by the bear, she welcomed the chaos into her life, and it really changed her, and she found that home for her became that place in Russia, and she couldn't stand being back at home.
Oh, fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating.
The section starts with the characters just arriving in London, and just beforehand Ina has given Laura a brooch, a Victorian mourning brooch like jet, but this one's made out of bog oak, which is a fossilized kind of wood. So dark and shiny and very hard. And that comes in at the end of the reading. London, but not what I expected. I'd pictured it like Paris, only filled with English voices. But from the train, it looked short, spread flat, and everything was prisons, factories, with painted English words for plain things, hats, pianos, window glass, and squared tower churches that looked unfinished, their pointed spires left off, their stone walls grimed with soot. Near the railway station, a cluster of men in pale clothes stood out against the dark background, and Ina said they must be from the countryside, which was a paler place. America was paler too, at least my part of it. White cotton and calico, bonnets, aprons, and wide washed skies. This London was dark and not clean at all. 10 minutes in and my nose felt smutted. The railway station arched high above us, and all around people knew where they were going. Everyone in a rush, everyone moving. Ah, yes, Monsieur Gautran said quietly. The natural Englishman, scuttling about as the sun descends. Pity there are no good cafes where we might retreat for a civilized rest before continuing. My stomach grumbled just then, and Ina laughed and clutched my arm. Me too, my dear. We have been too long on the road, and my goodness, I can't even remember when we lunched. You must be starving. We'll need to put a good meal in as soon as we get home. They said I could spend the night at their house, and in the morning, more suitable arrangements could be made. Otherwise, there'll be talk of impropriety, she said. And my brothers are rather particular about talk. But of course, you'll take your meals with us if you like. It's all a bit more humble than Paris, I'm afraid. Not half as romantic. Nonsense, my dear, said Auguste. Think of the excellent English names. Highbury and Holloway. What's not romantic about that? Well, it wasn't romance that moved us up here. Land's cheap in North London, Ina said, looking at her husband sideways. But he kept on with his own train of thinking. You have good place names in America, too. I always liked Soda Springs, Salt Lake City. Names you can taste. That's not fair. You're making us both ravenous. You should go and find us a cab before we faint. That first night in England, I slept with a brooch in my hand, and it felt good to have something to hold on to. It was colder than Paris, like spring was only just starting here. A slow northern spring, a new kind of weather. And the brooch in my hand was warm, like wood, and hard as stone. I was amazed someone had been able to carve it. But then they carved stone, didn't they? Like the stone pillars in Paris, with their secret symbols. And the brooch was a symbol too, of mourning, of grief. Holding it hidden in my hand, it felt like grief itself, like something that grew, then hardened. Something you might, if you looked at it right, carve away, pattern, and make beautiful. So, let's talk about Welsh characters,
Yes.
Welsh setting, how we, inhabitants of Cardiff, but not Welsh origin writers, face that.
Yes.
You can go first.
I can go first. Well, observation plays a large part to it. As years of living, after 23 years, I've had a lot of time to look, watch, observe, be a witness, be an observer, and collate some details which, to me, are significant. But I suppose if you are born in Wales, might not necessarily be significant in the same way. So I think my version of what a Welsh character looks like is very much tainted by my own experience. So it's only authentic insofar as it's born out of observation, but I'm not sure it's authentic in other ways. I'm not sure the voice of the characters, for example, is how a Welsh-born author would necessarily see my characters, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, voice I think is a tricky thing.
Yes.
Though my story, The Aerialists, is very much a Cardiff story.
Yes.
Most of the people who speak in it have come from away and are travelling through.
Yes.
Though not exclusively, and with the newspaper material that I include, those are Welsh characters. But I was very self-conscious in writing dialogue for Welsh people. Yes. And part of that is trying to translate my brain from being North American dialogue to British, and then from British to specifically Cardiff-based. And then also it was just recognizing the fact that Cardiff is very multicultural and historically is very multicultural. Yes. So there isn't just one stereotypical Welsh voice there. Yes. There's lots of people who work on the docks, who work in various different factories, and what are their voices and how do they sound Cardiff enough? One thing that I found in my research was that there's a Yemeni expression that you're getting a little Cardiff, which means you've made some money and now you're getting a bit full of yourself.
Yes.
Which that was a nice detail to be able to include in it.
Yes. Go ahead, sorry.
But I guess I was going to ask you, so Assimilation has scenes set in Cardiff.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a Welsh set book in its totality, because it does have these different threads in it. Do you think you might write a Welsh set book? Tricky question. Yes.
Yes. Not intentionally.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment is set in London, so I guess the immediate answer is no, because I lived in London before I lived in Wales. I don't know. I think it's a difficult one because the perception of Wales, both within Wales and from outside of Wales, is very set.
Okay.
And I find that as someone who has lived in Wales mostly in urban areas, my experience of what Wales is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, is probably very different from the sort of Wales you find on the page in literature often, which depicts usually more of a rural Wales, maybe. And I sometimes have to fight myself because I think there's a book called Welsh Plural which talks about this, which is talking about the many identities of Wales. And as you say, Wales in the 18th, 19th century was one of the most or Cardiff certainly was one of the most multicultural cities in the UK. And Wales has many influences, but that's not always reflected in literature. So if I did write intentionally a book in Wales about Wales, that's what I would want to portray. I would want to portray that wealth of identities that make the Wales that I've known and lived in for the last 23 years, which I'm not sure I ever really see on the page.
That's a really interesting observation. So not the stereotypical Wales,
no.
But more the lived experience.
Yes.
And perhaps coming from away, we are more aware of that.
Yes.
We're seeing it for what it is.
Yes, but arguably we both live or have lived in Cardiff, so
yes.
our experiences are very Cardiff-centric, which a lot of Welsh people would tell you is not the real Wales.
Yes.
And is, you know, even though it's the capital city, but it is how would you then I mean, I would not feel I have the agency to talk about rural Wales, for example, because I haven't experienced it.
No, sort of throwing your voice too far.
Yes.
There.
So I think I could only really ever tie it to my own experience, which is a very urban capital city.
Oh,
Wales.
that's interesting.
I think, or Wales of the future.
Ah, lovely, good.
You know, I have a story that's an essay that's coming out in a book called Women's Wales in a few months, and it was reflecting on the devolution and the impact it's had on women, and it made me think about as a woman who migrated to Wales, who lives in Wales, who has a Welsh family. What do I want Wales to look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? And I think that I would be more interested in writing about that.
That's a lovely contrast with what I was going to say next, which is I'm working on a character who is male, who is Welsh, but has left Wales.
Aha.
So completely the opposite.
Yes.
So his Wales is in the past, and he is a poetry professor, and he's trying to grapple with the idea of what does it mean to be an English poet. He's never been a very good poet, but he's tried to be an English poet, but knowing that he's Welsh.
Yes.
And perhaps his family has lost the language.
Yes.
And so he's only looking backwards.
Yes. I always find that poetry, particularly with Wales, it's fascinating because I suppose in the Welsh language there's different forms in poetry, but poets who are Welsh poets or poets in Wales have a musicality about their writing that I don't think is quite the same as what you find in England and in Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's very specific to Wales, and it's I always wonder how much of that is the Welsh language itself, how much of that is the very strong musical culture that is tied to Wales, and how that feeds into the writing.
And that sense of joining together in the music, that it isn't the individual voice, but it's the men's voice choirs, it's all coming together, it's the congregational singing.
Yes.
And how that is different from the solo voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a communal space.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think to me that's what Wales is. It's very much about that community-centric approach to the world, and whether you look at historically the valleys and the people and how they come together, or in your localities. I mean, where I live, I find during COVID, people very much came together and helped each other and checked on their neighbours, and in a way that I find fascinating.
Yeah.
It's lovely and brilliant. And I think I growing up, I had that in a very small, in a micro way, because I lived in a block of flats, and within the block of flats there were 6 families, and those 6 families, it was like a micro village within Paris. So we had that sense of communities, but then you go into Greater Paris, and it's big and unwieldy and personal and individual to the hilt, and so it's that contrast that I find interesting.
Yeah, well, maybe our smaller cities here in Wales can reflect that character a bit better.
Yes.
That we don't have that anonymity of being so large and isolated because of it.
Yes. And I mean, I suppose coming from Canada, where the distance are such that's a different scale again.
It is a different scale, and I think questions of, suburban zoning, for example, come into that, and large houses, so you're not chock-a-block with your neighbours, and larger kitchens, larger living rooms, self-sufficiency. I think there's different issues going on with the Canadian context.
Yeah.
But you're right that Wales does feel very integrated.
Hanoi. The air was swollen with the promise of monsoon as little Helen stepped out of the imposing white mansion, wrapped in a crisp white pinafore dress, a hand secured in 2 ouées. Il pleut, bergère, Helen began to sing, skipping shoulder to shoulder with the tiny Vietnamese governess. Together, they walked down the large avenue, along rows of impeccable gardens tended by armies of invisible hands. One nursery rhyme flowed into another and another, all the way to the gate of the Lycée Français. You have a good day, Uwe said, kissing Helen's forehead and handing her a parcel of freshly cooked nams rolled into mint leaves. Hooray! Hooray! Helen clapped excitedly before disappearing with her prize into the building. Uwe watched her go, nodding with satisfaction before heading in the direction of the market to buy provisions for the evening celebration. Madame had sent her with a list to help the cook, who was busy decorating a large birthday cake with swirls of blue icing sugar. Later, the cook would need to prepare the meat, but not until Monsieur returned with the hunting party. The men had left before dawn with their dogs, their rifles and their servants, eager to make the most of the last outing before the rainy season. Monsieur would be flanked with his 2 royal poodles and a turbaned attendant he had brought with him from India. The dogs were his pride and joy. Madame had told Helen that the breed was designed to retrieve canards, ducks, hence the name of caniche. Madame had lamented the way the British had diminished the animals by giving them the ridiculous name of poodle. Be they caniche or poodle, Uwe was wary of the dogs. She had heard stories of hounds being set loose on disobedient servants. The market presented a wide stretch of polychromic spreads hoarding mounts of fleshy vegetables, bright kumquats and spiky lychees. Farmers stood amongst the monticules, dressed in varied hand-dyed traditional wares, ornate with intricate jewelries, signifiers of the many tribes from central Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, who came to Hanoi to sell their product and had done so long before this part of the world came to be known as Indochina. The market was the only place where Uwe sometimes forgot the presence of the French. Their beige costumes and floppy hats seemed countless miles from here. Walking from stand to stand, she collected the items Madame had listed in a neat handwriting: citrus fruits for the sauce, leafy greens to accompany the canard à l'orange Madame had planned for her daughter's 8th birthday. Uwe thought that Helen would have preferred caramelized pork ribs and rice eaten in a kitchen amongst the indigenous help, so sticky it could only be eaten with fingers, teeth working their way around the bone, tongue licking at the toffee-coloured glaze. Madame disapproved, of course, but the thought made Uwe salivate. As she left the market, the weight of a basket made her walk lopsided. Damn canard à l'orange, she thought. Nearing the house, she heard incessant barking and loud exclamations, the words indistinguishable, so that she couldn't tell who was shouting. Past the street corner, she saw a gathering mass, men dressed in light-coloured, coming down from the surrounding houses, men dressed in black, appearing from tended gardens, all with their backs turned, fixated on a small brown form curled at the foot of the mansion steps. First, Uwe noticed the hunting party rallied around Monsieur. Then she saw the turbaned attendant struggling to haul back the crazed dogs. Monsieur raised a hand, commanding silence. The noise died down. "What is it?" someone asked from the crowd. "A dog?" someone else hazarded. Monsieur stepped forward and crouched near what appeared to be a mount of thick fur. What have they killed now? Uwe wondered. Monsieur placed his hand on the pelt and Uwe registered a ripple, immediately met by the mounting growl of Monsieur's dogs. "Take them away," Monsieur ordered, gesturing in the direction of the turbaned attendant. And then to the crowd. "This here is a bear cub." He paused, waiting for the murmur carried through the assembly of men to die down. Uwe watched as his hand started stroking the animal. There was a shudder. Then a little round ear fluttered. Poking his nose up, the miniature bear scanned the air. Monsieur continued to soothe the cub until it unfolded itself, causing the crowd to take a collaborative intake of breath. The bear sat like a contented Buddha, front paws resting on a rounded belly, observing Monsieur with interest. No taller than Helen, the cub's movements were clumsy, eliciting laughter from the observers. Questions were asked. Monsieur explained that the hunting party had killed a mother bear. It was a terrible tragedy, he added. The men found the cubs afterwards. He pointed at the dogs. They were making such a racket. The poor cub had a fright. "What will you do with him?" someone asked. "We have the space. We will take care of this infortuné." Nobody thought to question Monsieur, and after a while, the men just disappeared. Let's talk about publishers a little bit. When I originally approached you and we met for the first time, you obviously were already with your current publisher, and I was at the time, I believe, still looking for a publisher, and we talked about the different avenues to getting published. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit about how you found your publisher.
Sure,
It's quite
yes.
an interesting route.
Yes, no, I had a good bit of luck with that one. So I'm with the Borough Press, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. It's a literary imprint. And usually with an imprint like that, you are going through your agent and they're submitting. At that stage, I didn't yet have an agent, but they had an open submission window. And if you submitted full manuscript at a certain time, they would read through and they would give one person not only a book deal, but also an agent. So you get both in hand. Yes. And that was remarkable. That's what worked. And so I'm still with the same publisher for the second one. And they did a marvelous job on it. I was really thrilled with how they included archival material within it. So these images here appeared in the newspaper here in Cardiff in 1896. And that's, there's more of that material, this kind of thing here.
Well. Yeah.
Lovely trapeze man flying through the air. So that's been a great thing.
And so your book was published as a hardback,
yes,
and then as a paperback.
Yeah, the following year it came out as a paperback.
Yeah. So yeah, so my experience is very different. So after we met,
yes.
I followed your advice, but I guess I had a choice to make between trying to find an agent and look for a London-based publisher, or stay a little bit more local. And I think because at the time I was new to publishing, and we were coming out of COVID.
Yes.
Which had been quite a difficult time, I felt that what I wanted was a publisher that was maybe a bit smaller and would, I think typically with independent publisher, they'll publish about 12 books a year, so they have a bit more capacity to dedicate to you as an individual, I suppose, and if it felt to me that it might be a more nurturing experience whilst I was finding my feet. So my first publisher with This Is Not Who We Are was Sarin Books, which was exactly that. Which is it's a Wales-based publisher, very well established, and they provided. So you were talking about earlier about the experience of having many different types of editors involved in the editing process. I think my experience with an independent publisher is that you get allocated one editor and you work with that one editor, and it's more like a marriage, really. And you have back and forth, and the person familiarize themselves with your writing. With assimilation, because of the topic of the book and the fact that I was very interested in that perspective of women travelers and women traveling, I approached Ono because Ono is a different type of publisher. Okay. You've had some work published with them as well.
Yes,
but they're a charity, they're women's only publisher, and their ethos is to support and develop women's career, Welsh women's career, Welsh authors.
Yeah.
Right. Hono's ethos is to support Wales-based women in developing their career as writers.
And it seems like a very good fit for this book.
Yes, and I mean the editor was very wonderful, and I really got the sense that she understood what I was trying to do with the book, which felt, great, and they're really, really supportive. So I enjoyed this experience of working with small independent publishers, which is a very different experience to use, which is
yes. The thing with being with Borough is it is large. I mean, HarperCollins is large, but Borough itself is small. Smaller. So it's sort of boutique imprint with underneath it the larger umbrella. Yes. So it's a little bit best of both worlds. Yes. And the editor that I had there was fantastic. And I did have the same editor for both books, but then it's the different layers of editing. I had different eyes on it as well. And then it also just helped with distribution, that they could send the book to different places. And it's been remarkable getting feedback from readers in different places that I would never think my book would end up, and hearing how it resounds in different communities. So I'd heard from a woman in Australia recently, and her note was beautiful, and she posted it on social media, so it's not a private thing, but she was telling me that she'd been going through a difficult midlife experience, and as a way of coping with that,
she'd signed up for an aerialist class.
Oh,
So
wow.
acrobatics.
Yes.
She's discovering this new thing. With this on her radar, she's at her local library and she finds my book. And so she picks it up. She doesn't quite know what to make of it, but there's a trapeze on the cover.
Yes.
She thinks, this is for me. And she turns it over and she's reading, oh, it's based on a real story, real people. And she loved it. And what a vote of confidence. And she sent me this lovely note all about questions of safety and how we need to take risks in our life, but then also how we can provide each other with safety.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So that was just something, just one of those gifts that comes from this lonely literary life that we lead.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's how the writing echoes in other people's life. I'm curious. I mean, the assimilation is not out yet, so not many people have read it.
Very soon.
Very soon, next week, really.
Yep.
But yes, I'm curious to see how it's perceived, because the few people that have read it so far have all picked up on entirely different things about it. So it's I'm curious to see what speaks to people, I suppose. But yes, and I think for me, beyond the publishing experience, which was interesting, and I think it's interesting going through it twice, and so you twice with the same publisher, but maybe different experience or the same, or
different experience, but I think partially that's two sides of COVID.
Yes.
And with the aerialists, it was Waterston's Welsh Book of the Month, so that was a different experience.
Yes.
I got to travel around with that.
Yes.
And I think distribution was wider for the aerialists. So I've been getting the feedback.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so with assimilation, I don't know yet. With This Is Not Who We Are, it was quite interesting because it was my debut novel, so I had no expectations, and then I found myself shortlisted for the Welsh Book of the Year, which was slightly surreal.
Congratulations.
And it felt like a very strong vote of confidence to have your debut novel shortlisted for a prize. And it was, I think, to me, I mean, there was a lovely party. And I think it was nice because of the people being there. Was a celebration to me of coming out of COVID. It was the first physical party that had taken place in several years.
Okay.
And it was an opportunity to be with all the people who helped along the way. And I think we probably both find that certainly in and around Cardiff, is that in Wales, I don't know anywhere else, I wouldn't know, but there is a big community of writers, and people are incredibly supportive, and I found incredibly generous with their times. I mean, starting with you when I approached you, out of nowhere and asked you for advice, but I find that over and over again, people were very generous with their time, very generous with their advice, and very, very keen to help and support. And I'd like to think that's something that's specific to Wales. I don't know if that's the same elsewhere. I think that, to me, it's a Welsh element of the literary world.
Yeah, it feels that way to me as well. So. When I arrived here, I didn't really know very much about Cardiff at all. It was just the happenstance of work that landed my family here.
Yes.
And so then, you start looking around, what are the opportunities? And I saw the first Thursdays coming up at Chapter. So it's a literary gathering that happens once a month. I thought, well, I should go check that out, see who's there, see what happens. And absolutely enveloping and encouraging, and though it tends to be focused on poetry, there was a space for me to share my prose as well. And so I was sharing various early bits of the Heartbeats in Secret there. And it was wonderful to have a space where I could just give my work oxygen. And not even the feedback, although feedback and encouragement was fantastic, but to be able to stand in front of a room and say, here I am, this is what I'm doing, and thank you for listening. That's been a real gift of Cardiff. And the community just keeps going. And there's so many new events popping up and different opportunities.
Yes,
very good.
Very much so, both in poetry and fiction.
Yeah,
there is a lot going on, and it's very vibrant. It's lovely.
Yeah, yeah, and quite diverse as well. There's people writing all sorts of things here.
Oh yes,
yes.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear you talk about the Hay Festival.
Yes.
because you were one of the writers at work last year, I believe.
Yes, so my publisher put me forward, and I didn't know,
okay.
I believe, and I didn't know I'd been put forward. So I got an email. Actually, on the same day at 11 o'clock, I got an email saying I'd been accepted on the Hey Writers at Work, and about 30 minutes later, I got another email saying I'd been shortlisted for the Wales Book of the Year. So I suddenly felt propelled into
Very
this.
good day.
Yes, very much so, into this environment of Welsh writing, and
That's just lovely.
Yes, it was a very good day. And the experience of I didn't know what to expect at all. I had no concept of what the scheme would be about. And I felt that it was incredible, and not in ways that I had expected at all. It was incredible because there was 10 of us. It was a very supportive environment. People were lovely. It was nice to meet fellow writer coming out of COVID, because I felt like my first steps as a writer were very lonely because of COVID. So to be in a physical environment with other writers at different stages of their journey was wonderful. To have access to so many established authors who took the time to come and talk to us about their experience and were very generous with their advice was wonderful. The atmosphere of the Hay Festival is something to behold.
It's a special place.
It is a special place, and to find yourself in an environment where you know, as somebody who maybe a couple of years before that I had not really thought I would ever really call myself a writer without laughing. To then go to the bookshop at Hay and find that my book was on the shelf was quite an experience again, and it was wonderful. And I think the event, the scheme itself is 9 days. It's incredibly intensive, both physically, emotionally. It's a roller coaster of events. What you get out of it is takes a little while to digest, because there was so much. You get visits from authors, publishers, people in the industry who give advice and share the experience. We also had tickets to go and see a lot of events. So you get privileged access. You get to sit in a green room with all the famous people.
The glamour.
Yes, I mean, I did hug Alif Shafak. I felt like I'd achieved something. And yes, coming out of it, I felt like I was on sort of high for about 2-3 weeks afterwards, as I absorbed the experience. But I would recommend it to anyone who, you know, to apply. And it was a unique experience for me, particularly because there's a podcast in Cardiff that's called Get a Proper Job, which is about the experience of being in a creative industry, where, you know, family members jokingly always say to you, why don't you get a proper job? Being at Hay was the first time in my life I'd been in an environment and stayed in an environment for 9 days where you didn't have to explain that you were a writer or why you were a writer, because everywhere around you, you were surrounded by people who got it. And I think it's possibly one of the most empowering experience from that point of view I've had. Just to be surrounded by people that you don't have to explain yourself. The rest of the time you have to explain yourself to the world. What do you mean you sit all day and, you know, make up stories, and that's how the time to make a living, because everybody there does the same. With various degrees of success, but does the same.
But you're all in the same space.
But you're all in that space, and it felt really, and especially maybe as a migrant, where I have spent a large portion of my life trying to figure out where I belong and where do I sit. At Hay, I felt like I belonged.
Oh, marvellous.
So, yes, no, I would recommend it from that perspective.
What a beautiful thing to say. That's lovely.
But yes, so, but yes, and I think it is an internationally recognised festival set in Wales.
Yeah.
And people forget that, but Hay is in Wales, and it is in the Welsh countryside, and it's a beautiful setting, a beautiful town, a town of books with many second-hand bookshops, and it's and we can claim that one a little bit for ourselves. So yes, so that's the experience of Hay. But I think whether you go for a day or you know, are able to spend the whole week there, which is, I appreciate not everyone can. It's worth going. It's quite something.